Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's great to be with you here today. My name is Dr. Sarah Tindall. I'm on the clinical team with Dutch, and we're going to be covering the human stress response, a biopsychosocial overview and evidence based approaches for resilience. Just a little medical disclaimer here that everything we discuss today is for educational purposes only and is not medical advice. And you may be thinking to yourself, oh, another talk on stress? And the answer is yes, another talk on stress, because lucky for you and me, stress is a topic that remains evergreen. There's plenty of stress to go around all the time. Now, a few simple points for us to be aware of when it comes to stress. The first of which is that sometimes the notion of stress and how to treat it can be oversimplified. That's where valuable tools like the Dutch test can come into play so that we can gain a deeper level of understanding about our patient's adrenal health and stress. It is simultaneously also important for us to acknowledge stress does not necessarily equal pathology. Stress can be very useful in small amounts and can help us survive terrible situations, or at least help us get our chart notes closed, help us get that paper written, or that presentation completed. It's when there's chronic stress and a dysregulated response that we get into trouble. But elimination of stress isn't realistic, nor should it be the goal either. An appropriate goal when it comes to stress optimization is fixing our capacity to confront stress in a healthy way. Which leads me to my next slide, in which I regret to inform you I must share an announcement of bad news. And it's hopefully not really news, and there's good news too. But the bad news is stress isn't going away. It's always going to be here all the time. And it's not my intention to be overly melancholy or pessimistic, but hopefully it's brief moments of stress that speckle an otherwise enjoyable life. And again, I hope this isn't really news for anyone, but we hear our patients and maybe ourselves talk as if we'll get to this place sometime where if we can just jump through this hoop, there will no longer be stress. And it's just folly to think in that way. The other important thing here is that although there are some really fantastic supplements that have been shown in many studies to help with things like stress, anxiety, HPA axis, function, nervous system regulation, they don't really fundamentally improve the way in which we respond to stress. They can be immensely helpful in managing symptoms and be a really important part of a comprehensive treatment plan for our patients. But unless we work on some of those underlying causes of our dysregulated response and consciously attempt to make changes, you can take all the piles of ashwagandha you want, but it might not yield the incredible improvement you had hoped for. I submit to you that outcomes might be improved if the patient engaged in lifestyle medicine approaches shown to improve stress. And so that's where the good news comes in. We can improve the way in which we respond to stressors. By implementing some of these strategies, we can optimize our resilience, improve our health in a meaningful way. Some definitions are in order, I think, before we proceed. And I think we all know what we're talking about when we discuss stress and resilience, but for fun, I thought I'd share these simple definitions. Stress is a constraining force or influence that causes bodily or mental tension. Reminders here that feeling stressed is a normal biological response to certain stimuli and can be helpful in short bursts. When we're talking about resilience, we're generally talking about the ability to adjust easily to change or misfortune, the ability to literally or figuratively not get too bent out of shape. And so, with that, I will pose a question for us to keep in our minds as we move forward here. How do we bend rather than break? We'll explore some of the research on this together with our remaining time. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's touch on the learning objectives. So, we'll review and understand stress physiology and discuss some of that through a biopsychosocial lens. We'll explore some of the research on how modern lifestyle habits may contribute to stress and how to cultivate resilience. We will endeavor to improve our knowledge relating to interpreting cortisol patterns and review key points of Dutch adrenal results to help with that. We'll explore how these insights can be used to inform our clinical decision making for a comprehensive, individualized treatment plan. That's a lot to get through, so we better get started here. And we'll begin our journey with a brief physiology review, as that seems like the traditional place to start. And who am I to break with tradition? So we have our autonomic nervous system branches we all know and love. Our sympathetic nervous system activating our stress response, that fight, flight, freeze, and our parasympathetic nervous system that regulates the rest and digest portion of things and promotes recovery. And a healthy system ought to be able to function switching appropriately between both of these. We've got our friend HPA axis here, and this is showing what happens when we encounter stress. There's that stress, perceived stress coming into the brain there in this illustration, and the hypothalamus will release that CRH in the paraventricular nucleus. That CRH binds to anterior pituitary receptors. The anterior pituitary then releases the ACTH, which then binds to our adrenal cortex, zona fasciculata receptors. Our adrenals release DHEA and cortisol. The cortisol will feed back to the hypothalamus. So we have our rapid response. Say we get into a car accident like the one depicted here, and in seconds, we have the activation of our sympathetic nervous system releasing adrenaline and noradrenaline. We have our acute cortisol effects as well. So we can survive that situation and deal with it effectively. We will maintain glucose for energy. Our blood pressure and heart rate will increase. We'll have increased focus. And then all the things that don't matter in that moment of survival, dealing with that car crash, getting away from that mountain lion, whatever it is, are going to be decreased. So that means decreased immune function, lower digestive effort, decreased sex hormone response. And those acute effects are just fine when it's an urgent situation we need to respond to, evacuating a burning building, etc. But the chronic cortisol effects are the ones we tend to discuss when we're talking about the long-term health problems associated with stress. So that chronic stress and high cortisol might manifest as things like sleep problems, hypertension, mood issues, central adiposity, insulin resistance, immune dysregulation, hormone dysfunction, etc. These, of course, are the kinds of things that we want to prevent for ourselves and our patients. I wanted to share a few statistics on stress to highlight the prevalence. Most people are stressed. That's the main takeaway. The American Psychological Association gathers data on stress, among other things, and found through survey data approximately 75% of Americans report physical or emotional symptoms related to stress, and about 49% of Americans experience significant stress on a daily basis. What do people tend to stress out about, you may ask? The list includes things like personal finances, cost of living, work-related stress accounts for 76% of people. Also things like health concerns, both for ourselves personally as well as family members. Political climate and news is another big one. Globally, how does stress look? Much of that depends physically, of course, on where people are located, and also certain cultural expectations related to stress and mental health. But a 2025 study looked at data from the Gallup World Poll and found that approximately 35.1% of people worldwide experience significant stress in daily life. And that's survey data from about 300,000 people from 131 countries. The range of stress reported globally based on other surveys and statistics seems to range somewhere from 30% up to 70%. So again, stress is out there. We already touched on the acute and chronic impacts of stress and persistently high cortisol effects, but I found a few newer studies that highlight some of these things individually. So this 2022 systemic review looked at 18 different studies and found that it seems stress and cortisol may impact our decision making. They found substantial differences in decisions of the study participants depending on how stressed they were, suggesting that acute stress may have an impact on our ability to critically appraise risk. Although we have this increased focus with this fight or flight response that can help us survive, having that heightened response might not be as helpful when it comes to other important decisions. There's also some data demonstrating how increases in cortisol may lead to worse memory. So when we're really stressed, that may lead to issues with memory encoding and retrieval later. Certainly, there's an abundance of research related to stress and impacts on the cardiovascular system. We know, of course, that high stress can lead to things like hypertension and inflammation, both substantial risk factors when it comes to things like heart attacks and strokes. There's data showing strong links between work stress as well as social stress and increased risk for cardiovascular disease. So I do hope you have some friends and like your job. Again, chronic stress has been implicated in immune dysregulation over time. In particular, some findings that show high stress leads to slower healing as well as higher risk of infection. We don't want any of that. All right. So now we're going to talk about this biopsychosocial model as it relates to stress. So I think most of us are familiar with this type of biopsychosocial model, but it's helpful, a helpful means of understanding patients in general and the complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors, and creates a comprehensive means of understanding how stress impacts individuals. Because depending on those underlying factors, we're all going to have a slightly different, or maybe even a significantly different response to a given stressor. What's that saying? The same boiling water that softens a potato hardens an egg. So, this framework highlights that stress and the ways in which individuals respond to stress is inherently multifaceted and cannot be fully understood only by examining one component. This framework also helps provide a holistic approach to understanding stress and devising an individualized treatment. Because, of course, our response to stress emerges from this amalgamation of social context, cognitive appraisal, and biological signaling. And if we approach stress management and resilience through a more reductionist perspective, we might miss some of those critical underlying drivers and create incomplete treatment plans. So, next, we're going to talk a little bit more about each of these components before diving into that resilience portion of the talk. So, biological factors. This involves our body's physical systems and mostly our genetic predispositions, our internal wiring. Some examples here might include hormonal influence, transitions such as perimenopause, HPA axis, sleep patterns, insulin resistance, our physical health, maybe something like nutrient depletion or existing illness. To highlight one of the examples I just mentioned, here are a couple smaller studies that looked at the relationship between stress and insulin resistance. This first one was a small study with an N of 116 individuals. That study looked at daily perceived stress with a continuous glucose monitor just over a period of a week. That data revealed that higher levels of stress were significantly associated with elevated blood glucose in those with insulin resistance. Another study of 166 adults found those who reported higher levels of work related stress were significantly correlated with higher cortisol concentrations, higher fasting glucose, and increased HOMA IR. Next, we have these psychological factors associated with stress. And these are things like a person's beliefs, thoughts, cognitive processes, personality that leads to how a person perceives and appraises stressors. Some examples of psychological contributors to stress might include trauma history, mental health status, perceived lack of control, patterns of perfectionism, a pessimistic outlook. Different mental health conditions are associated with different stress and cortisol patterns. There's data showing that individuals with generalized anxiety disorder often will exhibit higher cortisol in general compared to those without anxiety, and also stronger cortisol responses to stressors than controls. So we correlate this with an overall more reactive HPA axis in general. Conversely, individuals with PTSD, potentially depression, studies there have demonstrated those folks tend to have lower cortisol levels at baseline and also in response compared with controls. The good news here again is that among adults with a trauma history, another group that tends to often have a more reactive HPA axis, some research has found those who subjectively report higher resilience have less hyperreactivity observed in their cortisol compared with lower resilience peers. So that resilience part really seems to matter. We have our social factors here, which has to do, of course, with our social support, our friendships, our family dynamics, romantic relationships. What is the social structure of our immediate environment? All those things can contribute to our stress. So, some examples here might be things like caregiving stress, perhaps social isolation, conflict in relationships. And next, I wanted to discuss some of the issues relating to the social element that are problems more specific to our modern human experience. Our phones. And things like social media are truly a double edged sword. I very much appreciate having the means to access all of human knowledge via this rectangle in my pocket, or to call my mom or FaceTime a friend on the East Coast. But there's some compelling research that has demonstrated maybe all of our phone use, and specifically social media use, has some negative health consequences. And a lot of this isn't really new data. There's this 2017 study that I highlighted here that looked at cortisol levels for Facebook users and showed higher levels of cortisol after they put Facebook away compared with controls who did not use Facebook. And that was despite the Facebook group not reporting any subjective increase in stress, which is interesting. And so the conclusion that was drawn is that perhaps social media use may impair normal physiologic recovery from stress. Another study, which was a cross sectional study of undergraduates of about 1,400 students, found a relationship between greater smartphone and social media use and higher rates of self reported stress and anxiety. Of course, maybe slightly weaker data here given the study design. Correlation doesn't necessarily equal causation, but there's quite an abundance of research here that has consistently demonstrated increased rates of things like depression, stress, anxiety among heavy social media users, particularly adolescents. It's not all bad news, though. Fostering communication is really important. And there is some literature out there that actually shows brief bouts of social media use was not correlated with any increase in stress. This 2024 study looked at salivary cortisol and heart rate before and after 20-minute sessions of social media or YouTube, and didn't find any increases in those. And in fact, for many of the participants, cortisol and heart rate went down. So some of that may have had to do with the content that was being viewed, or shorter duration of use. So, not all bad. Maybe limiting time is helpful there, or looking at content that's more lighthearted rather than maybe the news all the time. Also, not earth shattering data at this point, but it seems like there is still this issue with blue light from electronic devices and impact on our circadian rhythm. Some studies have found those who read on smartphones before bedtime that morning cortisol was elevated after having read without a blue light filter. Other research has demonstrated a relationship between evening screen use and poor sleep quality and sleep debt. One study here found that daily screen use before bed was associated with a 33% higher prevalence of poor sleep quality and later bedtimes compared with no screen use. Another more modern social health problem is a lack of social connection and loneliness. Some of the studies focused in this area found experiencing loneliness and lack of that social support was tied with higher evening cortisol levels relative to controls, also leading to interference with sleep quality. There also often is an elevated cortisol awakening response, indicating an exaggerated response to stress. Some other studies found reported similar findings where loneliness showed elevated daytime cortisol rhythms, higher in the morning and evening, flatter diurnal patterns overall. And so none of that is really what we want to see when we look at our adrenal health and our cortisol pattern. Okay, so what are we going to do about this stress? How do we bend and not break? We don't have time to talk about everything, sadly. Otherwise, we would be here all week. But I'm going to focus on some of the practical lifestyle interventions that we can counsel our patients on that seem to have the most abundant evidence on how we can foster a healthy stress response and improve that resilience. We need sleep, period. And it needs to be good quality sleep if we can manage it. That's a real challenge for some of our patients to achieve for a variety of reasons, but we know that we function better if we have good sleep. I think there's sufficient data regarding the importance of good sleep hygiene practices to maybe always discuss sleep optimization with our patients as a foundational aspect of health. Better sleep quality has been positively correlated with greater psychologic resilience, which makes sense when we think about it. If we if we get more sleep, then when we're confronted with a stressor, we have maybe more reserve to effectively deal with that. Reducing blue light from smartphone screens and other electronic devices seems to promote better sleep quality and has been also shown to improve sleep latency. Comprehensive meta-analysis of sleep improvement interventions illustrated how enhancing sleep quality leads to moderate reductions in perceived stress. Other data show that good sleep duration and quality were associated with better HPA axis health. So the diurnal patterns were more normal if people had good sleep quality and enough time to sleep. So all that stuff, like having a relaxing bedtime routine, maybe keeping lights dim in the house in the evening, having your room cool and dark, avoiding electronics 1 to 2 hours before bed can really have quite a profound impact on our sleep and therefore our resilience. Social connection has been identified in many different studies on various aspects of health research and has been shown to be critically important for our brain health, for healthy aging, our mental well being, and certainly for stress. It has been found that individuals with more frequent social interactions and better social networks have lower perceived stress. Several studies have shown that even these seemingly superfluous or somewhat superficial social interactions matter a lot. Some of that research is specifically on longevity, not necessarily stress. Some of those very large studies by Julianne Holt-Lunstad show significant reductions in mortality with better social connections and social integration as an important predictor. So do you talk to the cashier as they ring you up in at the line in the grocery store, or the barista as they make your coffee? Those connections matter too, in addition to our close personal connections. There's also research showing how volunteering can significantly reduce stress and loneliness. And just so all the introverts don't send me hate mail, certainly there's studies on how reductions in cortisol and stress from interactions with our non-human companions, our cats, our dogs, emotional support, alpacas, etc., can be very helpful in lower cortisol and stress. Exercise. I don't think there's anyone who would really try to argue against the importance of regular physical activity of some kind for maintaining good health. Certainly, we ought to strive for that 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise per week for cardiovascular benefit. But there are many studies that have shown those who engage in physical activity appear to have better sleep quality and lower cortisol levels overall. Other data show that exercise can reduce one's perceived stress and improve stress symptoms. A note here about exercise: you do want to be conscientious of the type of exercise you recommend for patients, especially if you're using testing such as Dutch to ensure that the form of exercise not only aligns with their health goals, but also would support what you see in their adrenal and their cortisol results. If, for instance, someone with a high cortisol awakening response and elevated cortisol throughout the day may benefit more from walking or yoga, perhaps forms of more gentle exercise rather than a really intense weightlifting session. Mindfulness based stress reduction. This is a really important one. They're all important, but there's just a ton of evidence out there for MBSR. So for those who may be unfamiliar, this is a program that was developed initially by John Kabat-Zinn in the late 1970s and was originally created to help patients with stress related conditions and chronic pain at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. It consists of an 8-week program that combines things like yoga, meditation, body awareness, and mindfulness. Participants are expected to engage uh, daily at home for about 45 to 60 minutes. There's 2.5-hour weekly classes, and near the end of the course, typically between weeks 6 and 7, there's a day-long silent retreat. Acceptance components of mindfulness training is one of the key mechanisms that helps reduce stress in daily life. There's improvement in emotional regulation, better cognitive flexibility, and reduced reactivity to stressors with this type of program. A couple more recent studies I found on MBSR, the one at the top published in 2025, the other 2022, showed positive outcomes for participants of these MBSR programs. One group was healthcare providers during the COVID-19 pandemic, which was a randomized controlled trial that showed reduced cortisol levels and improved focus within that mindfulness based stress reduction group compared to controls. This other study on women veterans looked at those who were high risk for cardiovascular disease. And in that MBSR group, found participants had a more rapid decline in diurnal salivary cortisol compared to controls, and also reported improved well being and less subjective stress. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is another really huge one that has tons of data to support its efficacy. This is an approach where the whole point is targeting thoughts and behaviors that are unhelpful and teaching cognitive reframing and coping skills. So it works by strengthening our adaptive coping skills, actively reframing our stress perceptions so that when we encounter stress, maybe if we went from 0 to 60 and we're incredibly stressed by something, we can have the capacity to not react in that way and to reframe the way we interpret that stress. The studies that examine these combined therapeutic approaches seem to have really good outcomes. Wouldn't you know it? Things that have been shown to be helpful, you put them together and they're even more helpful. So, some of these trials incorporate, like this one, both of the interventions we were just discussing, the mindfulness based stress reduction and CBT, and found that these multi component programs had moderate positive impacts on stress and resilience more consistently than a single program alone. I came across a few studies on smart resilience training preparing for this talk, which I was somewhat less familiar with. And several of them are focused specifically on medical provider participants. So, somewhat similar to MBSR, it's an 8 week program structure and it has classes that are 1.5 hours duration per week. It was developed by the Benson Henry Institute for Mind Body Medicine, and it consists of these multimodal stress management interventions that include, like MBSR, meditation, other mind body skills, cognitive strategies to mitigate stress, but there's also this interesting emphasis on healthy lifestyle habits. So, getting adequate sleep, good nutrition, exercise, and then also social support. This study from 2021 found that there was less perceived stress, better mental and physical health, increased job satisfaction. Unfortunately, no substantial change in burnout because we can change the way that we perceive that stress, which is great, but there are limits. We can't adjust our patient load or alleviate some of that administrative burden. But overall, participants reported better coping skills and resilience. Lastly, I found this 2024 meta analysis that included 96 randomized controlled trials and found stress symptoms as well as anxiety and depression improved with combination lifestyle interventions, including all of the good things we've been talking about: emphasis on good nutrition, physical activity, sleep hygiene. So, we didn't cover everything, unfortunately, as I said. We don't have all week to spend together. We've got like 20 more minutes, maybe. But these interventions that I mentioned are categories that appear to have some of the best evidence, especially in the cases like MBSR, CBT, that can really shift how we think about stress and decades of research. But there's tons of other lifestyle interventions that have good validation, some of them more esoteric than others, but other things to consider would be, for instance, biofeedback or neurofeedback. Emotional freedom technique has some research. Grounding or earthing, forest bathing. Simply, you don't even have to go on a hike, just going into a green space. It has been shown to lower cortisol and improve our stress. So, lots of other things to research and explore for patients potentially if you're interested. At this point, we're going to go ahead and make some connections among topics and incorporate Dutch testing into our stress conversation. We're going to be looking at a few different examples from the summary page of the report of the adrenal section, and some of these mini adrenal cases are from Dutch Complete and others are from a Dutch Plus. So I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page here as I'm discussing these. The only difference between the two panels is that the Dutch Complete measures urinary free cortisol, while the Dutch Plus measures salivary free cortisol, and thus includes the cortisol awakening response, or CAR. This CAR, this cortisol awakening response, is the percent rise of free cortisol from waking to 30 minutes after waking, and it's kind of like a mini stress test. It estimates a person's ability to deal with a stressor. So in this example, we see the CAR is at 4%, and therefore this person has an under response to stress. Along with our updated report, we released what we call the Dutch Dozen, which is an interpretation framework that includes 12 different assessments of findings on the hormone testing summary page, which is page 1 of the report. And this allows clinicians to quickly and comprehensively evaluate their patients' results and create individualized treatment plans. So here's what that looks like. We see all these numbers and colors here. Each of the numbers corresponds to part of the Dutch dozen. The purple numbers corresponding with the estrogen and progesterone section of the summary page, the blue numbers corresponding with the androgen results, the pink numbers reflecting the Dutch dozen assessments for the cortisol section. In case anyone is interested, we do offer live Dutch classes specifically on the Dutch dozen and how to apply this framework to a case. But for today's talk, since we're focusing on stress, I'm going to keep the emphasis on adrenal health. So, this is how we'll apply the cortisol assessments to the results, and we'll take a closer look at each of these. So, the first assessment here, which is the ninth assessment overall, is telling us to analyze the daily free cortisol pattern plotted from the urine samples in the case of a Dutch complete, or if we're looking at a Dutch plus, that's saliva throughout the day. So, looking at this pattern helps us to identify uh, deviations from the expected diurnal cortisol rhythm, which can impact things like someone's stress, someone's energy, and their sleep. The new design of our test makes it even easier to quickly identify data points that are out of range because anything that's within normal limits will have a green circle around it, but anything outside of normal will be encircled in red. So when we look at this particular example, we can easily see that mid sleep and the waking data points are elevated. They're red, they are high. An important note here, too, is that urine samples reflect the cortisol level that was collected in the bladder in the hours prior to collection, just so we're all on the same page there. For this next assessment, we want to evaluate the daily total of free cortisol in circulation, which is the 24-hour free cortisol dial. This is a sum of the data points from the diurnal pattern of cortisol, and this measurement gives us insight into the overall level of cortisol in circulation. This can be very helpful in assessing things like burnout when we might expect cortisol to be very low or determining if there's overall elevated levels of cortisol. In this example here, we have a 24-hour free cortisol that is within normal limits at 145. The third assessment, or 11th overall assessment, is telling us to evaluate the metabolized cortisol, which reflects the adrenal gland's total cortisol output. Clearly, in this example here, we have an elevated result. Then, our 12th and final assessment is the cortisol clearance rate, which is the ratio of THF and THE to cortisol and cortisone. A low cortisol clearance rate, which is lower than 20th percent, indicates a slower clearance, and a high cortisol clearance rate, 80th percent or higher, suggests faster clearance. If you have findings at either of these extremes, it informs you that there may be some underlying metabolic problem that's impacting HPA axis. What are those things that can cause those patterns? Don't worry, I have a slide on that. For the low cortisol clearance, we're going to be thinking about things like the possibility of liver or gallbladder stasis, hypothyroidism, or very low caloric intake. For a high cortisol clearance rate, considerations might include insulin resistance, obesity, hyperthyroidism, fatty liver, and inflammation. Next, we're going to evaluate some sample results with this framework, and then we're going to assess several different adrenal results to practice interpretation. Okay, so we are going to first assess the daily free cortisol pattern. We see some red dots there, and so we can clearly tell the morning and bedtime free cortisol are above range. Next, we're going to assess the daily total of free cortisol in circulation, and we see that that is elevated. The next one is to assess the total cortisol produced by the adrenal glands, our metabolized cortisol here, which we also see is high. And then lastly, we're going to take a look at this cortisol clearance rate, and we note that that is within normal limits. Okay, so what are the patterns we're likely to encounter, and what are we going to do about them? Great question. I'm so glad you asked. Before we dive into results, I want to mention this fantastic resource that we have available, which is our handy dandy Dutch treatment guide. It can be really valuable when you're putting together a patient's treatment plan. And if you're just feeling kind of stumped, or maybe you want some other treatment ideas, you can take a look at this on our website. All right, so we're applying our Dutch dozen, just the cortisol results as we examine these results together. And as we were saying previously, we're going to start by looking at this daily free cortisol pattern. And this is a 25-year-old female reporting anxiety, acne, struggling with weight loss. When we take a look at this, we note most of this is high. In fact, the only normal data point here is the mid sleep sample. Next, we're going to look at that total cortisol in circulation, our 24-hour free cortisol. We observe that this is elevated. And then we're going to look at our total cortisol production, this metabolized cortisol, which we see is within normal limits. Lastly, we're going to look at the cortisol clearance rate. We see it's quite low at 3%. So we're going to be thinking to ourselves, maybe there's hypothyroidism, perhaps insufficient caloric intake that needs to be addressed so that we can fix that pattern to help our patient feel better, because perhaps her anxiety is related to some of this higher cortisol. We're going to potentially implement some lifestyle adjustments to lower that. We might consider some supplements to help, something like phosphatidylserine or L-theanine, perhaps some adaptogens. Next, we have a 63-year-old female reporting anxiety and sleep disturbance. We observe that her cortisol awakening response here on this Dutch Plus is elevated at 264%. That informs us that this gal is having a disproportionately high response to stress. And as we assess this daily free cortisol pattern, we note all the data points are within normal limits. They're all green, but we still would want to target this cortisol awakening response, potentially with calming support, maybe something like meditation, journaling, etc. And then, although normal, she does have sleep disturbance, and I notice that her bedtime data point relative to the dinner data point is high. So at nighttime, maybe she would benefit from making sure that she's got good sleep hygiene practices on board, has a calming, maybe yoga session or meditation, or perhaps something like L-theanine might be helpful. Next, we're going to observe that saliva cortisol total. We see that that is normal. We've got our metabolized cortisol representing our total adrenal output, also within normal limits. Cortisol clearance rate is normal. Okay, this next one, 39-year-old female PCOS struggling to lose weight is what she reported. And yikes, look at that waking cortisol. It is so high. So this pattern, we sometimes call a dysglycemic pattern when we see a high waking data point and then the rest of the pattern just kind of decreases throughout the day. This not only can be related to blood sugar dysregulation, but it can be reflective of things like poor sleep in general, things like insomnia, other things like obstructive sleep apnea, high stress or anxiety could be factors here to consider. So, we're going to want to focus on fixing things at bedtime because this is a Dutch complete. So, this waking data point reflects from bedtime to waking, there's a problem with cortisol increasing. We need to figure out why and address it. But lowering cortisol could be helpful. So some of those restorative, relaxing bedtime, pre-bedtime routines could be helpful. Things like potentially adaptogens, ashwagandha, L-theanine, etc. Next, we'll look at this 24-hour free cortisol. It's high. Metabolized cortisol, high normal. We see a low normal cortisol clearance rate at 23%. Okay, so for this one, we've got a 35-year-old male reporting fatigue, anxiety, depression. And we see here it's a Dutch plus. There's a cortisol awakening response. It is negative. So perhaps related to the depression, maybe something else. And this would be an area of opportunity for us to support, maybe with something like light therapy, use of a light box, getting sunlight in the morning, exercise, perhaps stimulating adaptogens such as rhodiola could be helpful here. Overall, low pattern throughout the day, and then just this crazy elevation at bedtime. So, this would absolutely be something for us to ask the patient about if there was anything anomalous that happened or if this is his normal. Or could there have been something else going on? Next, we're going to look at the salivary cortisol total. We see that this is high. We've also got our metabolized cortisol, which is low, and we've got this low cortisol clearance rate. So, not making very much cortisol, but kind of hanging around in the tissues. And when it comes to a pattern like this, we want to think about, could there have been a hydrocortisone contamination? Because the pattern doesn't really match anything else. And we could have said that with the previous case too, but that one wasn't a hydrocortisone contamination. So when you do suspect it, you want to go down to the full adrenal page on page 4 and look at the pattern of cortisone versus cortisol. And we see here this cortisone for bedtime is within normal limits, nice and normal, and seems to align with what we might expect with the rest of the pattern here. After talking with the provider, this was indeed a hydrocortisone contamination. The patient was using it during testing and probably just touched the filter paper after having applied it. So, good example here of what that can look like. We've got a 26-year-old female reporting insomnia, anxiety, and weight gain. And yikes, we see that we've got this lack of a diurnal pattern, which is a red flag, especially if it's really high or really low. This is something to pay close attention to. It's high throughout the day. And then looking at the 24-hour free cortisol, we see that this is elevated. Of course, we see the metabolized cortisol also elevated. Cortisol clearance rate is normal. So if this is something where we would want to rule out a condition such as Cushing's. If that's ruled out and somehow isn't Cushing's, then we would want to support cortisol overall by regulating circadian rhythm, potentially nutrients and herbs to help to normalize this pattern that we're seeing throughout the day. 39-year-old female here, PCOS, insomnia, hypothyroidism, and fatigue. Her cortisol awakening response is a cool 452%. So, low waking data point really skyrockets in the morning. 60 minutes after waking, we see still high, does come down dinner time and bedtime. So, we're going to want to put some calming support with her, things maybe like lavender, California poppy, meditation, lots of options. We observe that the saliva cortisol total within normal limits, metabolized cortisol also normal, cortisol clearance rate within normal limits too. These are just some snippets from our treatment guide. So, if you were listening to me throw out suggestions there and weren't clear on why I was saying the things I was saying, again, this is a great guide. So, calming support, I mentioned some of these. We've got exercise considerations that can be helpful when cortisol is elevated, as well as some lifestyle and dietary suggestions. Nutrient support, other lifestyle things, deep breathing, gratitude, other botanicals, and so forth. The rest of these patterns are kind of low patterns. So, 62-year-old female reporting fatigue and sleep apnea here. This is a low CAR, it's negative. So, higher waking data point, and then kind of just decreases throughout the day. So, we see everything within normal limits except for the 30 minutes after waking, but it's kind of low normal. This would be an area of opportunity. We'd want to support that perhaps with stimulating support, doing exercise, maybe something like resistance training, perhaps light therapy. Looking at the saliva cortisol total, we see that it's within normal limits, a little on the low side, metabolized cortisol on the low side as well. So maybe some herbal considerations would be something like cordyceps. And then we've got a normal cortisol clearance rate here. 36-year-old female, chronic fatigue, depression. This is the kind of thing that we often get calls about where clinicians are really concerned, oh, could this be something like Addison's? And I understand the thought. It's not quite low enough for it to be. These data points still are within normal limits, but there certainly is not the rise that we would expect in the morning. And we would want to support that with some of the stimulating support that I've been mentioning here. 24-hour free cortisol is what we want to look at next. We see that that is low. Usually with Addison's, we're worried if that is under 10, if the metabolized cortisol is under 500. So we see that this metabolized cortisol, reflecting that total adrenal output, is perfectly normal. Cortisol clearance rate also looks very normal. So stimulating support for this person hopefully would help. Okay, so we've got a 42-year-old female here reporting depression, fatigue, vasomotor symptoms. This is a Dutch plus. We observe that her cortisol awakening response is low at 6%. So there is a little bit of a rise here, but it is low. this would be an area of opportunity with some of the stimulating support options that we've been discussing. We also note dinner time data point is low. It is normal at bedtime. We do want our cortisol to be low at night so we can go to sleep. And then we're going to look at the saliva cortisol total, which is low. We've got our metabolized cortisol also low, and a normal cortisol clearance rate. Now, this one, 55-year-old female reporting fatigue and insomnia. This is a diurnal pattern that is really, truly flat. Everything is low except for bedtime. And when we look at the free cortisol, we see it's under 10. It is, in fact, 5. And the metabolized cortisol, 481. So, and a normal cortisol clearance rate. This would be a situation where we would be concerned about something like Addison's. However, for this patient, I happen to know that she was using a strong steroid at the time. Here's a good example of how much steroid medications can suppress things in terms of our adrenal function. A good note as clinicians are talking with their patients about maybe doing a Dutch test, and a good note for patients to be aware of as well, especially things like cortisone shots. People tend to forget about those, but they can impact things for weeks. A 62-year-old male reporting past medical history of hyperlipidemia as well as fatigue. So different from some of our other patterns where we saw higher data points and then decreasing. This is in the urine. So mid-sleep is elevated here. So between bedtime and the time in which that was collected, 1:25 in the morning. Waking data point is low normal, and then it just kind of decreases throughout the day. So we might be thinking here, what's going on with sleep? Could there be something like insulin resistance or sleep apnea that may be factors here? And then we're going to want to support this pattern, maybe exercise, light therapy, as I've mentioned a few times, some of those stimulating adaptogens like maca, for instance, or others, maybe something like ginseng, because we see 24-hour free cortisol is low normal, metabolized cortisol kind of barely within normal limits there, very normal cortisol clearance rate. And here's a little excerpt from our treatment guide, again, talking about some options for when there is a low CAR. So lots of different choices to consider for nutritional support, lots of different herbal options and lifestyle choices. Light therapy is mentioned here, and some other herbal approaches. Just a couple more before we wrap up here. 38-year-old female reporting insomnia, fatigue during the day. And so this would be one where, based on some of what we've looked at today, maybe we'd be thinking, could it be a hydrocortisone contamination? But we've got we've got the cortisone here, and so we can say no, it doesn't look like it, because these patterns do align with one another. And if it were a hydrocortisone contamination, that cortisone would be normal while the cortisol itself would be high. So this tells us there is something going on at bedtime. Always good when something is anomalous like this to double check and see, did something weird happen? Was she getting sick? Did she have a migraine? Was she really stressed out? Because all of those things can cause our cortisol to increase. We know she has insomnia, so maybe that's just her normal, in which case we're going to really want to work to implement some healthy lifestyle strategies to lower that cortisol, maybe some botanical options as well. And then we're going to want to support what we see here in terms of some of this low cortisol, although her cortisol awakening response is normal. So that tells you there is a proportional response to stress. Saliva cortisol total normal, metabolized cortisol normal, and a normal cortisol clearance rate. A 59-year-old female, past medical history of type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and hair loss. And we are looking at this diurnal pattern here. It is quite low. And then we get this weird blip around dinner time. And this is the kind of thing a lot of clinicians will call in about and say, why is this pattern the way it is? And I'll say, well, I don't know, but it's not a hydrocortisone contamination. We see cortisone matches the pattern of cortisol. And so it would be a thing where you want to check in with your patient and see maybe was there significant stress or an anxiety attack, something like perhaps a lot of caffeine, and maybe the person doesn't usually drink energy drinks, or embarking on a rigorous new exercise program. Some of these things can cause increases in cortisol. So you'll have to chat with your patient to see what was going on. We see there's a normal 24-hour free cortisol, metabolized cortisol, normal, but there is this high cortisol clearance rate. So in metabolized cortisol, much higher here than the free cortisol. And this would be something we'd want to think about underlying patterns there, maybe insulin resistance, infection, obesity, etc. We've got a 36-year-old female reporting anxiety, fatigue, depression, insomnia. And we see here there's a negative cortisol awakening response. And this is somewhat similar to some of the other patterns we've looked at, but they're all a little bit different, you know? So, normal waking data point, but then things kind of just decrease. We observe this mid sleep elevation in cortisol, perhaps as a reason for her insomnia. So, we're going to want to think about stress, anxiety, things like sleep apnea, and so forth. Um, and then we see that saliva cortisol barely within normal limits, metabolized cortisol is normal, and there is a high cortisol clearance rate. So rapidly at the tissue level, things are getting cleared out of there in terms of cortisol. And we see cortisone pattern aligns with the cortisol. Okay, how about this one? 22-year-old female, acne, hair loss, anxiety, dysmenorrhea. What's wrong here? Nothing. Trick question. This is perfect. This you should hold this in your mind as a shining example of what we should all endeavor to achieve. Excellent diurnal pattern, everything completely normal. Looks great. As we wrap up here, just a few reminders. Lots of different options for us to support high cortisol through lifestyle means, various therapies, lots of choices for calming support. If there's low cortisol, again, lots of lifestyle choices, lots of therapies that have been shown in studies to be efficacious. Stimulating support can be really helpful. And then, as we've discussed ad nauseum now, lots of sleep hygiene and circadian rhythm support options that can really make a difference in terms of someone's overall health. And so, with that, I thank you for your time and attention. Best wishes for a happy and healthy new year, and may your stress response be normal.
Thank you for joining us for this insightful webinar with Dr. Tindall. We hope you learned something useful. You can learn more about the research behind the Dutch test at dutchtest.com/research, and make sure to visit the Become a Provider tab at dutchtest.com to register for an account so you can gain access to even more hormone education and research. Be sure to follow us online at Dutch Test and subscribe wherever you get your socials to stay in the loop for upcoming webinars and podcasts.